Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm Susanna Blume, Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense Program here at CNAS. And joining me today here is the Director of our Technology and National Security Program, Paul Scharre. And our special guest here today is Brett Goldstein, the Director of the Defense Digital Service. Brett, thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. Before we get started, I'm just going to run through a few admin notes. This conversation is public and it will be recorded. We will post the video after the conclusion of the event. We're going to reserve about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of our session to take questions from the Zoom audience. So to submit your questions, please use the Q&A function, which you will find in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And please note that we will not be taking anonymous questions. You must identify yourself in order to get an answer. And for those participating in Zoom, for optimal viewing, we suggest you click on video settings in the lower left corner of your screen and select hide non-video participants. And we also recommend that you keep it in gallery view. And so with that, Brett, I want to dive right in and basically start at the beginning. What is the Defense Digital Service and why does it exist?
So DDS is one of the weirdest units in the DoD, I'll put it that way. So if you were, I like to refer to us as the SWAT team of nerds. So a little different over in the defense sector. So we were created in 2015. I'm the second director, and we're really weird because what are we? I report directly to the Secretary of Defense, and I run a group of about 80 nerds. And who are we? We're engineers, data scientists. I'm a computer scientist and a data scientist. And we work on some of the hardest problems at the DoD. And the advantage to where we sit is we can work anywhere through the services. If there's a terrible tech fire somewhere, we're able to go right away. We don't have to call anyone. We can work on the problem. Or if there's a big capability that we need to focus on, we're able to tackle that. We recruit primarily civilians. So our folks come in for 2 to 4 year terms. They typically will come from the Silicon Valley environment. And we have, in the military, we like to talk about selection. You go through a selection process to get into your typical defense components. We have a really rigorous technical selection. So I'm fortunate to run 80 of some of the best technical folks that are in our country, and we work on some of the hardest problems that we can find here at the DoD.
So you mentioned both this kind of SWAT team type mission and also a desire to really find the hardest problems in DoD and get after them. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now?
Sure. So when Chris started DDS, it was a much smaller group, and they focused on bringing innovation to the DoD. And that was great because candidly, between you and I and a couple of our friends right now, innovation isn't always our strongest suit. When I came in, I want to grow our capability, and we got into a couple different areas. On the more traditional side, we have things like hack the Pentagon, which at first sounds really, really scary because you're like, hack the Pentagon, I'm gonna go to jail for that. But it's a group where we focus on creating bug bounties for DoD systems. We want security researchers, hackers, folks like that to look at what we're doing and say, here's a vulnerability, here's how you make it better. Our more recent activity in that space is the Air Force and DDS had hacked we called it Hack-A-Sat. So at the DEF CON conference this year, for those of you that don't know, it's one of the biggest cybersecurity events of the year. We actually had to capture the flag on a satellite. And that was one of our activities where we're encouraging, and now it's throughout the DoD, to look at our resources, find weaknesses, help us make them better, and continually raise the bar of hardware and software. So Hack the Pentagon's an example of a bigger, long-standing effort. But at the same time, I want us to get a little more operational because to support the effort of national security, it's not just about big enterprise programs, but it's critical operational need. So a good example of what we're doing right now is DDS and the NSA are partnered in the Cyber Protect mission of the vaccine as part of Operation Warp Speed. That is a great example of we bring in amazing talent. We have our partners at the NSA, and we are every day working on that mission. And that's really about today and something that's critical to the American people. At the same time, when COVID broke out, we looked at what are other things we could do. So one of them is we created mysymptoms.mil, which is a symptom checker that is designed for the DoD and the broader DoD family, because a lot of the tooling out there were for folks who have different life circumstances. So the ability to partner with the medical community and bring the best in diagnostics means that less people are going to show up at the clinic and be able to figure out, like, do I need to be worried? At the same time, we were able to generate software which helps for self-reporting of symptoms. When you have a population as large as ours, let's make technology a force multiplier. And the beauty of DDS is we're able to turn these things rapidly. And then also within the past few months, we've gotten into the counter UAS business, where as we think about near-term threats, we're worried about essentially small drones. So one of our teams within DDS is what we call a rapid response element. If something weird shows up, we're able to fly there and just figure it out. And so this has created a portfolio that ranges from everything in big enterprise, how do we make our cyber capabilities better, to fly teams that can just address wicked problems, and we just go and tackle them.
The Department of Defense certainly has enough wicked problems to go around, certainly for a team of 80 people. There's a lot to dig in there. I just want to throw to Paul. Paul, what do you think?
Thanks, Susanna. Thanks, Brett, for joining us. You know, one of these wicked problems that we're talking about is the disconnect between the pace of change in software and DoD's acquisition timelines. You can't buy software the same way that we buy aircraft carriers. We can't operate on these decades-long acquisition timelines. How do you think about what needs to change inside DoD for how we think about, develop, and acquire software?
So you're dead on software, and it drives me crazy when I like death by PowerPoint. You're showing me a 40-page deck, and you're telling me what you're going to do over the next 5 years. And I just, as someone who grew up in the Silicon Valley world, you just don't do that anymore. So we try and what we do at DDS is try and lead, but also help in this case. I want us to move to less of a tell me and more of a show me culture. What does that mean? Do a couple sprints, show me what is there, and then let's be willing to pivot. As we talk about software and we talk about, layers and layers of requirements, that doesn't work. So what we espouse is a user-centric, sprint-driven culture, which allows for that failure, but allows for pivots. Now, there's lots of cases where we're able to do this, but it is a big cultural shift. And one, you need to get people comfortable with this. Two, and fortunately, Ellen Lord has been an amazing partner in rethinking procurement, rethinking software, Platform One, all of these different architectures which allow this. But then at the same time, it's bigger than DDS. I can go and I can talk to people all day long, and I have the horde of nerds who can go help. But you're right, there's only 82 of us. How do we get people to understand this in the services, in the acquisition community, and get more comfortable to move away from that requirement-driven approach to sprint and agile?
You talked about culture, Brett. I'd be curious, what do you see as the main obstacles in implementing the approach you're describing? Is it culture? Is it a lack of human capital? You mentioned, the 80 folks that you have. Do we need more people with the right expertise in DoD? Are there, issues involving acquisition processes and contracting that need to change? what are the right levers for DoD to pull to begin to put in practice what you're describing?
Or flexibility in spending is another one I might add to that list.
Yeah. So the whole stack are issues we need to solve. One, we need to get comfortable with the idea that you're going to pivot software. If I do a contract and I say I need a system that does X, you cannot, I have not met anyone who is smart enough to delineate all of the requirements from day one. This is work with the users, develop with and for users at the same time, and have flexibility to pivot when it's wrong. We need to stop these conversations where we're saying, we agreed to do this, we're committed to this path. You have to allow that failure. In my old life, that was how companies went under, when you were committed to a plan and you didn't allow that flexibility. Two, let's talk about talent. So we have some amazingly talented folks at the DoD. We need to continue to grow, water, feed them. We did a project with the Marines where we got 5 Marines. We wrote about in War on the Rocks, a battle for Moncala, where one of the Marines, who's this amazing engineer, he was assigned to supervise a drug testing unit. And we need to find ways when we have that talent to identify, grow it, mentor it, do pieces like that, so that we can have more and more folks outside of these innovation units, but have that be a trade and expand upon that. And we see this within Cyber Command, Army Cyber, all of these different groups. But I would argue that as we think about multi-domain operations, this is something we need to work harder on. More talent, more comfort. 3, I'm sure we've all been in meetings where it starts to get technical and someone says, well, I'm not a coder, okay? Right, but it's not a binary. Like there are a variety of things. Like I know how to fire a weapon, okay? I'm not terribly good at it, but there's a continuum of that. I am comfortable, I can clean and safely manage a weapon, but I am not a sniper. But with software, well, I'm not a coder. We need to get people more literate with software. How do you think about technology? How do you become more comfortable with data? What makes good software? When you're evaluating a product, how do you ask the right questions? How do we make sure we're investing in clean and secure code? It's not just about hitting the deliverable. I care about security. And then the other piece is broader talent. I think we as DoD, we as the US government, make it really hard to want to come work in government. The paperwork is brutal. We send people to USA Jobs. Like this is like a website that isn't going to speak to technical talent. We need to not write position descriptions that are written in government for non-technical folks. As we do outreach, we need to talk to folks. We need to be able to explain the role, speak in their language, and make the effort to go to them and bring that level of talent in here. So you have a composition of people in the services who are gaining skills. You have career folks who are able to progress in a way that's really great for them, but also have people like DDS folks who say, I want to do something different for 2 to 4 years. I want to serve my country. We should make it as easy as possible to serve. And that way we're able to all contribute in different ways.
So I actually want to stick with this issue of talent for another minute here. I think that, absolutely hear your point on making it easier for people who, with the skills that the department needs to come serve. And there seems to be kind of a fixation on like recruiting tech talent into DoD, but you also mentioned upskilling existing talent and improving literacy across these technological issues, within the workforce that already exists, both military and civilian. And I wonder if you can share with us your thoughts on kind of the balance between those two and how do you get after that kind of developing the talent that you already have in the building?
Yeah. So The way that works for us now, but I worry it doesn't scale as well, is we will bring in military members, and then we put them on projects. And so they might have the bones, they know some Python, they know Java, something like that. And then we embed them with our folks, and we level up that way. And so we're bringing the best in the private sector and then using those skills. But we need to think about this more broadly, because we're doing 5 or 6 folks at a time. How do you think about software in a way that's a little more creative? For some folks, it's fine to read the book and watch the PowerPoint and then write code. And then there's platforms that make things easier, but there's also something to be said for getting a couple of years of real engineering experience. I like the combination where you have some senior level engineers that are coming from the best and the brightest, who can serve as mentors and then help folks get there. But part of it then is, when they start to get there, how do we keep them in? How do we make this, I think it's incredibly fulfilling to be able to serve your country, but there's always wow, I can write some serious Python now. Should I go off into the private sector? So I think this also applies to, we spend a lot of time talking about data and AI and ML and things like that. How do we have creative, maybe a little more private sector oriented education there that create the building blocks for things like this?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I want to pivot a little bit to something that Paul and I have been talking a lot about over the past couple weeks and months, and that is this idea of defense innovation. Where are we? Where have we been? Where are we going? What's the unfinished business? And Paul, I'll just throw to you to kind of like tee up this issue, and then maybe we can go back and forth about it a little bit.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit is the challenge of scaling up innovation. The DoD has created a whole set of different organizational innovations. DDS is one of them, but also organizations like Defense Innovation Unit, Kessel Run, Project Maven, Joint AI Center, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think about scaling the kinds of things that DDS is doing, and in particular, the ability for how DoD changes, how it acquires software at scale? We've talked about how, you got 80 people, there's limits to what you can do. How do we do this across the whole department?
So I like the idea of there being more than one area of innovation. You have different perspectives, different services, different life experience, all of those pieces. The part that the straddle is about reusability and sustainability. And one of the things that drives me crazy is, why would we build 10 different flavors, or even worse than that, of the same item? We need to do better when we think about reusable software. Now, I think there's things like Platform One with the Kubernetes stack that start to give me hope. Let's build platforms that create a baseline for security, for tooling, for pieces like that, and then start to pick some winners. Now, if I am creating some, say Kessel Run creates a great set of code, we need to then start to amplify that, not necessarily be competitive with it, but hammer it, harden it, extend it, and go from there. The other piece, besides, and cloud and architecture platform one should be leading to that reusability, sustainability matters. And one of the mistakes that I worry about every day is I build something super amazing, but then I expire and no one is there to maintain it. And what worries me more than it dying is it becoming dusty, because dusty software and dusty tooling is actually really dangerous. So we try and go in with, we charge ahead on a project, but we try and have that theory of sustainability from day one to prevent that outcome. A good example is we worked a project called Boba. which is a biometric system that runs on Android for friend or foe detection. And it's like, I think it's a great piece of software. It was an amazing team of both DDS and more junior Army folks. So it turned into a great educational opportunity. But we finished it and then it transferred over to PM Bio, where for PM Bio, it's now a leapfrog for them, which is a win for all of DoD, but it's a win for us as well because it's going into the bigger machine and it can be sustained. So more succinctly said, I think innovation cells need to do a good job of talking to each other and picking some horses and then making sure that we find a way to get them sustainable for widespread adoption.
I think the example you just described there, Brett, is a great one because, the whole idea is that eventually these technologies have to make it out of the little, innovation cell or incubator where they came from and into the broader departmental architecture in order to survive. And it's that leap, I think, where sometimes that's the hard part, right? Because it means you've got to make room in budgets and you've got to get, the folks in those other parts of the department bought into your vision. How's that working out for you? Sorry to ask that in a slightly glib way, but
no, it's hard. And my approach to that is I like to show people real things. If I show you some beautiful presentation of all the magical things I anticipate I'll build, you're like, okay, great. I've seen that before. But when I bring a capability to the table for, within sort of the confines of my reporting or whatever service we're working with, and I'm like, hi, friend, we built this, it's real, and now we just need to get to yes. And when you show people real things that, like, what part of our mantra is, our job is to leapfrog capabilities, save lives, do things like that. And when you're delivering on that, you're starting to have a culture of get to yes. So where I've been successful is, and Boba is a good example. When I pull out an Android and I show you in person, this is how it works compared to the current capability, people start helping you. And because it's a win-win, it's a win for us because we're finding that sustainability. But when they can realize the leapfrog, absent having to do the work prior to that, but we still occasionally run into that situation of, oh, there's a quick 40 forms or things like that. And those are super.
Yeah, I know both Paul and I have had a few of those moments ourselves. What you're describing is a successful pattern that I've seen a couple times where these, innovative units, I'm thinking, SCO had done this a couple times that I witnessed, basically where they buy down the technological risk in a thing for a service, right? You present a service or piece of OSD, whoever is going to inherit the thing with as you say, something that actually works. It's much more compelling than like, hey, I've got this crazy idea, but we don't know whether it's going to work or not, and it's going to cost some money to figure that out. So I think that's a real part of the secret sauce for sure.
I think it's for many of the things where we've been successful, like one comes to mind where we did a couple all-nighters, we built something, and then we didn't know if we could, but we suffered the pain on the front, and then it worked. And doing just like, we need to sometimes talk a little less and execute a little more. And sometimes we'll be dead on, sometimes we'll fail, learn from the failure, and then be okay with the failure and just try again. Like, that's the type of environment we really need to encourage. And Americans are innovative. We need to foster that innovation here.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, did you have other thoughts on this topic?
I think this is great to hear. This is exactly the kind of thing that people have been talking about for years, that, we're so hamstrung by a risk-averse culture in DoD. And, there are times when that makes sense. If you have a giant multi-billion-dollar program, you want to make sure you get it right before you start building things. But there are other places we've got to just move fast, do it first, see if it works. That's exciting to hear that you guys are doing that and that's working out well. We're also getting some great questions coming in from the Q&A. Susanna, what do you think? Should we turn to that?
I actually just have like one or two more that I want to sneak in before we go to the audience. Sorry, I'm taking the prerogative. I want to ask two more questions. One is about DoD's relationship with Silicon Valley. And I think that there is a narrative out there that Silicon Valley just doesn't want to work with DoD. And like, there's some good reasons for that and some less interesting reasons for that. But the existence of your organization and the kind of talent that you're able to recruit into the department belies that narrative. I also can't help but point out that a big chunk of Silicon Valley was built with dollars from the Department of Defense. I can't help but make that point every now and again. But how does it look to you, right? This sometimes strained relationship between DoD and the country's tech hub.
So I hope this doesn't sound glib. I read about it in the news. I don't feel it. And I'll admit, I don't have a ton of friends, but my friends are so supportive of this job. And, I talk to them and like, I grew up building Open Table and like, I talked to the folks from the old days and they're like, oh my God, you have the coolest job in the world. And it's been great for recruiting. And, during the pandemic, like we've onboarded, I think 30 folks. And there's been this, I think there's this high level messaging that's out there about the relationship here. Whereas when I talk to people on the ground, I talk to people in the venture capital community and there's such enthusiasm about being able to bring the nerds into government and work on this. So I see it in the paper, but I haven't felt it.
It's so funny that you describe that you're describing, the tech folks as nerds. I always think of like us policy wonk government types as nerds as well. I mean, we're really just all nerds, right? Shouldn't we be able to get along?
Yeah, we're all happy, fun nerds. It's just like there's something about like nerds a while ago had a bit of a different meaning. But when you think of the problems that my team and others in the DoD with these various skills can solve, it's remarkably fulfilling. Like I grew up being like, oh, it's like special forces are cool. I'll never get in, but special forces are cool. Now with technical skills and your example of policy skills, we all are able to do amazing work and we all contribute to the national security and improving government, improving the DoD in different ways. And it's like, I know it's certainly fulfilling to me and being able to see folks who have come out of the Valley to, like one of the folks recently came on who lucrative Valley position. And he's like, this is the most fulfilling job I've had in my life. And that's awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I'll just point out that Paul was in special forces. Paul was a ranger and
special operations, but we won't get into all that.
Yeah. You're right. You're right. I knew as soon as I said it that I'd messed it up. Don't at me. So I just want to encourage our audience to keep populating the Q&A and we'll turn to that in just a second. I have one final question, but Paul, do you have anything that you want to jump in on before I ask that one?
I just wanted to follow up. I mean, what do you think the biggest advantages are that DoD has in this space in attracting that right engineering talent? What are the things that DoD can offer that are, maybe you can't get somewhere else?
So I sometimes explain it to new recruits as choose your own adventure. You can work on everything from things like move.mil, which was an amazing, more traditional web software project to help with the PCS process. Okay, awesome project, impactful to families. Maybe that's right for you. For others, like I've been over in Afghanistan a few times to work on various projects. that's an experience as an engineer. You really like, when I went, the first time I went to Afghanistan, I was on a helicopter and I'm like, I can't believe I am doing this. I'm wearing body armor. I am just like, there's some big guns. I don't even know what they're called. And it's an amazing experience where you're able to do things that you could never imagine. But then the results are so impactful. Um, you know, I've done the I've done the building a company thing. I've done a variety of different things where honestly, I thought they were really impactful. And then I took this job, and you do things that you'll never be able to do in any other way. And with us, it's, you can do the whole spectrum. And it'll be a really, really hard 2 to 4 years. Like, this is a tough job, but you leave and you're like, I made a difference. I'll never experience something like that again. And I'm looking forward to a very long vacation.
That's great. That's really cool.
So my last question for you, Brett, is one that I often end with, and I just want to know, what is the one thing that you're most proud of having worked on during your time at DDS?
I think so. Probably it's to date our COVID-19 work. So pandemic hit, shutdown is going. The health protection condition was going up, and we started to get flooded with requests for assistance. And ranging from, I mentioned mysymptoms.mil to we supported symptom detections in Guam, to all of the remote telework issues. And all of this was going on at once. And so this is probably mid-March, and I was sitting in my car and I'm like, oh my God, I have all of these requests. And I reached out to the team on a Saturday, and I'm like, if people are willing to surge and help and have time to get onto a bridge, let's talk through all of the things that are coming in. And I was like, everyone started signing on to the meeting, and we were just doling out ops. And we started surging on supporting telecommute. We're supporting Guam. We're working on symptom detect. We're working with DHA. We're working on a variety of other missions. And this element of the DoD, who doesn't come from this world, who isn't used to the Saturday heater, in the middle of a pandemic where many of us have our own families and drama and sort of the hard things that come with that, just surged. And we went from being a relatively typical Monday through Friday component to 7 days a week, working multiple time zones and surging. And I would argue we helped save lives by doing this. And I was so proud of the team for surging and doing this and being completely swamped. And it showed that when when it hits the fan, when you have an amazing component like this, in technical ways, you can provide impact all over the world. And so it's an amalgamation of different projects, but it was just a surge. And it showed that when technology can be super impactful to saving lives.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what it's all about. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that story. I think we should go to the audience and take some of your questions now. Audience, please feel free to send them on in using the Q&A function, which you'll find in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Please remember to identify yourself with your question, as we won't be taking any anonymous ones. And we'll get started, but please keep them coming. The first question I have here is from Hassan Al-Noon, and they ask, what are some of the incentives that DDS provides to the tech talent to ensure they stay around and not move out into the tech giants in the private sector?
So for my folks, from your first day, then your clock starts. you'll be here for your typical term is 2 years, and then you could extend for 2 years post. The majority of folks go back to the private sector. And I'm actually fine with that, because the idea of you come in, you surge, and then work on hard things and go back is fine. We do have folks who will end up being CIOs and CTOs within government. And that's always, when you get toward the end of your time, I ask you the question, I'm like, do you want to go back to the real world, or should we be talking about other places to do that? For tech talent within, I think we all try and play an active role. That, and I like to, and I'd encourage people to read the Battle for Moncala article that Scharre Glavy and I put into War on the Rocks. We need to, as leadership, we need to take an interest in some of these junior folks, make sure they're in the right roles, mentor them, help them grow. When they're not growing, figure out what's going on. I think that's a way to go. And then clearly, by an incentive to a lot of folks I meet, is working on meaningful projects. I think for those of us who are engineers, we've all written some code that is the most boring thing and uninteresting thing in the world. Give people some wicked problems. Give them some critical code. Give them that sort of meaningful work, and people get excited.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that time and time again, that engineers, more than anything else, they just want hard problems to work on.
It's so true. Like, there's a couple of my folks who just know that I'm storing these wicked problems, and I'm like, you're looking bored. Let's go talk. And then people love a challenge, and engineers love a challenge. And honestly, we have some challenges.
Yes, certainly that's true. Our next question from the audience is from John Raviv, and he's asking, are there any surprises in who your industry partners are? And is that list changing as DoD becomes more open to non-traditional partners?
So I don't know if there's surprises. The enormity of the DIB and the types of partners and who we work with is pretty daunting for someone who didn't grow up in this world, and understanding the players and how they tie together. I think meeting some of the non-traditional entities is always interesting. I spend a lot of time worrying about the DIB, but that's more of my, how do we think about cybersecurity practices? How do we make sure we have solid code? How do we decrease vulnerabilities? But then also, how do we form those relationships that say, okay, we found something, let's fix it, let's validate it. Let's be, I challenge anyone who's written 100,000 lines of code or more to show me zero bug code. If you're advertising zero bug code, we gotta have a, this isn't for reals talk. So I think we're starting to meet more and more folks. We should meet more, and we need to find ways to continue to bring best practices of all sizes to this group.
Thanks. This is great. We've got more questions piling in. We've got a question from Mila Jasper, a reporter with NextGov, who's interested in learning more about DDS's counter UAS work that you'd mentioned earlier. Can you tell us more about that?
So we focus on essentially detect, defeat, and then respond. Our mission is really in the small UAS realm. So think the drones. So we have developed, we have hardware that we can use to detect. We have developed, and I think there was an article out there talking about what we did with the Comfort and the Mercy, where we were providing overwatch for potential small drones over the Navy hospital ships in support of the pandemic, which is another, I should have listed that in my pandemic response. So we do detect, we do understand, we look at the data, but the piece, one of the pieces I'm really, really proud of is this rapid response team. It's how do you go from, I have seen something in the sky that's weird, to figuring out what that is. And if you were to look at the team, you'd be like, I'm super impressed with the tooling and the skills. We have everyone from a small drone pilot to a doubly an electrical engineer to an RF analyzer. So that these folks, and they were working on a project last week, say, here's the mission, hop on the plane, take all sorts of interesting bags of stuff and solve the problem. For those of you who don't spend a lot of time in the space, an object in the sky to what it is and how to manage it and how to make sure our folks are safe is actually a hard problem.
So we've got another good question here from Al Calamug, and I'm really sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Can you provide an overview of DoD's adoption of artificial intelligence, how you're thinking about leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning to enable the warfighter, and how DDS is helping DoD close the gap with foreign countries who may be leading in AI?
Okay. So we work closely with the Jake. I actually, I've spent time with the new Lieutenant General over there before, worked with Jack Shanahan quite a bit. As a data scientist, I'm certainly excited by this space. But this is a part where, actually, I'm about to get really boring. But before I say that, so this is exceptionally important to the mission right now. We have done a great job of creating systems that collect data. We have sensors, we have platforms, things like that. But when data becomes large, understanding it and being able to leverage it in a performant way is hard. But we often skip to the end and talk about AI. I like to be the boring dude in the middle, where I care a lot about platforms. How do they talk to each other? How do we make sure, like, sentences that get me really excited are if you're talking about an open standards-based API, that's pretty exciting. Machine readability, really exciting. Schema, metadata, also exciting. These are the key things that as we dive into this world of AI, ML, and those pieces, we need to make sure we get the platforms talking to each other. We need to make sure that we architect them in a technically intelligent way using those sorts of standards. You don't want a bunch of data silos in this. And then you certainly hear a lot about things like JADC2 and these upcoming systems. Let's build that smart, performant architecture, because the beauty is when you build it that way, then the ML and the AI slide in really nicely. You can do a really smart analytic, you can do a smart algorithm, because remember my comments before about sustainability. Like I could, you all could ask me to build a really smart analytic now. I can build it, but will it work over time? Will it work during a conflict? Will it work during adverse circumstances? So I'm really excited about this. And I've been hearing more and more chatter about building these smart foundations, leveraging things like Platform One, and then having the analytics on top. And one of the things that I didn't mention that we've added into DDS in the past year and a half is a data science team. And before it was primarily, we would have engineers, product managers, designers, folks like that. Now we have a data science element. And by doing that, we're able to bring some of the best in architecture, engineering, and science to those sorts of elements and help them out.
Yeah, so speaking of data science, Mila Jasper asks, DoD recently released an enterprise-wide data strategy. What role, if any, will DDS play in implementing that strategy?
So we're close partners with the new Chief Data Officer, Dave Spurk, and he's someone who we worked with when he was down at SOCOM. And it's been great to see him come into the role. And we actually were fortunate to be able to collaborate on these concepts where how do we have the right balance between here's how we're thinking about it without like I was noting before, a gazillion requirements and all of these different pieces, but how should we speak about data? And so Spurk and I spend a lot of time talking about making sure a system can talk to each other, ensuring open standards. How do we think about ontologies and pieces like that? So this is a close partnership because we're all aligned in this is one of those critical areas that we need to get right. And for me, right is not just the outcome and the shiny end, it's all the underbelly that we're going to build. We need to get that right because that's critical to our national security.
Thanks. I've got another question here from Greg Nance, and he asks, what challenges are keeping you up at night?
Well, the longer I stay, the more I'm up at night. So things that keep me up at night. So some we've already talked about. Talent throughout the services. I worry about my component is the right size, but how do we have more and more who are going to be part of the broader machine and not just innovation cells, part of the broader effort. So I worry about longer term a cyber career for folks who are coming in as lieutenants and making sure they have a good pathway. I constantly worry about cybersecurity, and I worry about everything from bounties to how do we think about software to how do we software. Okay, in traditional military, you can check a tool with a checklist. It's I have a pistol. I'm going to every X number of weeks, I'm gonna make sure it's oiled, it's working, all of those things. Software changes every day. We iterate on the software, the platform, the OS, all of these different pieces change. And because of that, while software can be better, it can also be weaker. So how do we move to that culture of this is very dynamic? How are we constantly assessing, improving what we have out there? Because as you have more software, especially going to the prior question, as we think about ML and AI and those pieces, all of these things are within a stack. And I need them to be strong and resilient on the day we need them. So moving to that sort of model of ongoing, yeah, I'd say that's one of my 2 a.m. specials.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's not like a discrete issue. That's like a meta.
Yeah, I'm really worried about it. And,
Yeah.
you know, and that's, but as we embrace some of these pieces and we think about continuous ATOs and pieces like that, there are ways in the private sector, we constantly release software. That's part of continuous delivery. As we move to that culture, we start to build the scaffolding for pieces like that. But we do need to worry about it every day. And something I try and, so before I came into government, I'd heard the expression like good enough for government work. And that drives me nuts because there is no more important mission here. So we can never be complacent. We always need to try harder, and we do need to worry about these scenarios.
I agree. Paul, do you have any closing questions or thoughts or feelings even?
Just a minute for a few minutes. No, I mean, look, this is great. This is incredible, the work that your team is doing. And this is great to get a chance to pick your brain. I want to maybe take a step back and talk a little bit about the bigger picture, and that DDS is one example of organizational innovation that DoD has done over the last 5 years. We talked about some of these other institutions that DoD has been creating to try to bridge these innovation gaps, right? Moving from innovation to innovation adoption and to find ways to do so at scale. I'd just be interested in what you think the lessons are for the department from the DDS experience about organizational adoption sort of writ large, right? And ways to create new entities like this that might fill a gap in something that's going on in the department and then integrating it into our operations.
So one of the biggest lessons that I've taken from this is it's not just telling people oh, you're doing it wrong, or there's a better way. I hate being that person in the room who's just critical and then you walk out, because then what are people supposed to do? I think we need to innovate well, we need to be involved in a longer life cycle. So maybe you have a component who's doing it wrong, whatever technical issue you want. Okay, we'll identify that. But how do we make it better? How do you teach them a different way? How do you not just be the innovation dude, but carry them through, here's a better way to procure, or here's some sample code, or here's the folks you need to bring in and who will help you get there, and then spend the year or two, be willing to have a longer tail, and then get them to a broader capability. So some of the things, like, I consciously try to avoid circumstances where I'm going to go and tell people they're doing it wrong and I leave. Instead, I'll sit down with, like, it's just not terribly nice.
No, it
Never
won't
helpful,
make
really.
you popular. It
No,
definitely won't make you popular.
Thanks.
But help folks. I've now had the discussion, and we've actually extended some of our recruiting efforts to help place the right people in there to create that scaffolding, and then be able to mentor them along the way and leave it better than we found it, and create those. Sometimes people just need a win or two to gain confidence, and then the unit or the service or whomever it might be is able to build their own on top of that. So there's a long game here where often we feel rushed in innovation. We need to show something shiny, something like that. Got to play a long game. We need to foster talent, build scaffolding, help inoculate people on the risk issue, and then build that capability and capacity.
Well, thanks, Brett. And we're coming up on the end of the hour here. We've got a great question from Cecil Haney that I want to tee up to close things out here. He asks, any ideas in terms of how we should organize military units to be better organized around data and to operate or change software in the future? Should these be skills trained into our existing organization and manpower structure?
So, okay, on the data side, I like the idea of common frameworks. And how do we have what are, how do we think about NoSQL, SQL, any of these different pieces? What are languages that I can have portability in? Like, it wouldn't make sense to me if, for example, the Army did R and then the Navy did Python and then all of these different things. Now, we don't need to overly litigate this, because it's just, let's pick some examples of common things we can iterate on so that we get at that reusability piece. Now, coupled with that is sort of part B of the question. Let's stop some of these greenfield platforms. And I know I've mentioned things like Platform One a couple times. That's a great example of, like, let's coalesce on some things where someone has taken care of the underbelly and some of the security frameworks tooling, and then focus on top of this. And this gets to my, earlier I talked about, why are we building 10 of the same thing? Now, we don't need absolute homogeneity, but we should have shared tooling. We should have some shared frameworks. We should have some shared languages, and then we can cross-pollinate while allowing us to get out of businesses and management of some foundational platforms that we can stop worrying about and let things like Platform One and some of the other clouds do. We're all individually, we're all not that special. So let's just pick a couple and let's get them really, really right.
Wise words that the department should collectively heed. We are just about out of time here today. Paul, thanks so much for joining me here, and many thanks to you, Brett, for taking your time to come have this chat. We really appreciate it, and thanks very much to all of our audience for tuning in and for asking such good questions. I think that wraps us up for today. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.